Welcome to Lit Happens, Unpacking Senior English. I'm Adriel.
And I'm Belle.
We're experienced English teachers dedicating to supporting both new and experienced educators in a world in which we are often time poor, to empower our students to excel in their English studies.
If you're an English teacher, like us, navigating this curriculum, then this podcast is designed with you in mind. And our mission really is to break down the complexities by unpacking English nationally. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Lit Happens episode with Adriel and Belle. Thank you for joining us again for another week. Today, we're going to be continuing our Module C text selections, and we're going to be looking at Catherine Cole's text Home. So thank you so much to Adriel, who's going to be leading this little breakdown and give us some pointers. How are you doing, Adriel?
I'm good, thanks. Excited to jump into this text. It's a fantastic little piece, and looking forward to exploring how we can teach this in order to get our students to, craft their writing as well to the best of their potential.
Wonderful. Let's get into it. So as Adriel just said, this is one of the prescribed texts in the Module C Craft of Writing course, and it's quite a lovely text. I think the beauty of it, it's very evocative, but in a very accessible way. So, what more universal idea is there, I guess, than the concept of home? And Catherine Cole so beautifully presents us this story. So let's get into the first question, Adriel. We want to talk about first Catherine Cole's personal and cultural context. So how does this influence her purpose in writing her text Home? And then how does this connect to the Module C's rubric in shaping textual choices and meaning?
Yeah, that's good. So how does Catherine Cole's personal and cultural context shape her purpose? I mean, this is something that we always have to look at whenever we are exploring a text, especially creative text, as we discovered last week with The Pedestrian by Ray Bradbury. And it's very, very important. So for us, we look at Cole's context, her interests in migration, which are shaped by Australia's sort of multicultural landscape. This drives her purpose, and it's very important. It's to explore a refugee's search for belonging amid loss. So I guess if we take a little bit of a step into this text, I might give it away a little bit, but I think it's a fantastic little way to sort of introduce it. And you might get your kids to do something like this, where you might say to them, hey, picture this, maybe get them to close their eyes, where it's like a man steps into a brittle fibro house in Sydney's west, a stone's throw away from Rockwood Cemetery. And it's his first refuge after years in detention, yet shadowed by a past that he can't reclaim. And what you're doing is you're establishing this great idea, this great sort of setting, and you can see the links there to Catherine Cole's context and some of those ideas to do with her purpose there, which is to explore that idea of migration. And it's such a nice sort of way into the very fabric of our society here, Australia's multicultural landscape, as we sort of look at. So I think this is a text that's very relevant to us, and it still remains relevant for all students. If we dive a little bit more into her purpose again, it's to explore that refugee search for belonging amid this loss, which is, again, it's a human experience that a lot of refugees will face. A lot of people that do come from countries that might not have the same opportunities as Australia does. They can definitely relate to this text quite a bit. So she uses things, that tie to the Module C's rubric, where, personal context shapes perspectives. This idea of personal context shaping perspectives. We see her use motifs, recurring images or ideas to thread this meaning throughout the story's structure. You can sort of see, for example, in the line where she sort of mentions unpruned roses, just like those at home. So those roses pop up again and again, symbolizing Ahmed's lost family and the resilience that is represented or symbolized through those roses. You might see it again, in that scent of decay and the sun on stone in the cemetery, which is a motif tying his new life to the lingering grief of his past. So what we need to look at for our students is, the fact that these choices aren't random. They reflect Cole's empathy for migrants like Ahmed, who are caught between the past and the present. So for us in Australia in 2025, these roses might echo our own cultural roots. I mean, I like that imagery there of nature, the roots there that we sort of get. So For you, they could mean something else. And this is the beauty of her text. Module C, remember, asks the students to see how context fuels craft. Okay, context is very important. Again, if you want to do another little activity here, just to frame the context, you might get your students to, again, imagine Ahmed tending to those roses. You might write it with like a motif, like, for example, petals clung through the seasons. And you might weave this through your own piece to layer meaning about memory or hope. And you can get students to play around with that natural imagery and play around with motifs and extended metaphors in particular when it comes to this creative writing. I think that will definitely stand out when we're teaching our standard English text or standard cohort. It stands out in the marking center as well when they can apply some of these higher order techniques. But yeah, that's a little breakdown of a bit of context and purpose there of Catherine Cole. Again, beautiful text, beautiful to read a little bit about her and, you know, watch maybe a few videos on her. She's got a whole website to get the students to read through it as well and really look at how her context shapes her writing.
That's fabulous, Adriel. Thank you. Especially that little tidbit about her website and the videos. It's a great suggestion. I think you made an excellent link here to how structural features of a text can represent a writer's context and also the purpose and what they're trying to achieve. And it's great food for thought for teachers of Module C, but also for students who are looking to springboard, you know, how they might incorporate their own extended metaphors or symbols or motifs within a piece. That's excellent. Can we talk a little bit about Ahmed, the protagonist, and more specifically looking at like mood and the emotional state of Ahmed and how perhaps in what ways Cole varies sentence lengths and makes very specific stylistic choices to represent the mood and the tone in the piece?
Yep. No, definitely we can look at that. So remember, Mod C is all about the style, the language, the form, and it's very important once again for us to focus in on this. And when we look at home, we can look at a lot at Cole's syntax, her sentence structure. Okay, and this is where the magic sort of occurs in this piece. I do want to preface this a little bit with our students writing, especially with the standard cohort. You'll generally find them, I mean, if they are to structure it, all they'll do is pop it into paragraphs, which is fantastic. You know, it's better than the blocked writing that we'll often see from students. So, I mean, that's probably a starting point. Get students to, you know, paragraph their work, which is very important. But get them to think about why and how they use paragraphs. And then, you know, further still, the sentences. I always see this in Mod C texts in particular, where students, we need to sort of explain this, that every sentence, every word has a meaning and it has a purpose. It needs to be used intentionally, and sentence structure definitely is something that we see Cole using in her own work here. We might look at Ahmed, for example, in the instance where Ahmed turns towards the cemetery gates. Walking alone helps to pass the time while he waits for news of his daughter. Now, in that little quote there, we can see it's a short, sharp sentence, okay? His abrupt shift then to a longer one, stretching out his restless waiting. So you see how like a sentence has purpose here. It's reflecting the mood, the pacing, the tone of the story. And that's something that we really need to drill in with our students. It's very, very important. Later on in the text, he mentions this quote, he knows he cuts an odd figure amongst the sandstone's ruins of the century-old graves, stopping to read an epitaph or to pull out some weeds. So this is a sprawling sentence here. It mirrors his wandering thoughts. It sort of continues a little bit more. And you can see a little bit of the difference between this and the previous sentence that we're sort of looking at. Just bear this in mind. It's not just grammar, okay? This isn't just grammar. What we're looking at by Cole's deliberate choices here with sentence structure is, you know, her presenting Ahmed's heart on the page. And that's very, very important. That's something that engages the reader. It's something that a reader will take away from their own piece or from your piece that you are presenting to them or you're getting your students to present. So again, if we go back to this idea here of Ahmed's heart on the page, we see it's, you know, clipped when he's tense, flowing when he reflects different ideas. So the tense flows when he reflects different ideas here. So for Module C, it's a lesson in pacing and mood through style that Catherine Cole sort of presents to this picture. Again, we might have that idea of, Ahmed waiting for that letter. We see in the line, time drags, hope flickers still, a candle in the dark. So again, it's short, then long. So this use of syntax here, like, it definitely represents that mood and that pacing that we're trying to really get into our students' writing and get them to reflect. It's not just filler words, as I like to call it. Okay, like every word, every sentence needs to have some sort of purpose. And I think the varied sentence length, especially here, has a great sort of influence on the enhancing of mood in Catherine Cole's story. And this is something that students can apply to their own writing. It's something where we'll get them to use syntax to say, for example, if they're looking at a character who's anxious, a character's anxiety might be represented through cutting sentences short, then lengthening as they dream for a, future which might not be attainable at the moment. And this really shapes the vibe of their piece, that tone and that mood. So yeah, there's a few things there in terms of stylistic choices that we can see. I mean, there's so much in this text, but we don't have all day to talk about this. But I would definitely speak a little bit about that sentence structure and the way it sort of represents that mood in our own pieces.
That's great, Adriel. Thank you. Really helpful. I know as a teacher, I, sometimes don't give as much weight to pacing and tension, or maybe not that, but more so it's easy to kind of forget a little bit about pacing and tension when you're comparing to really big or unique techniques. But I think pacing and tension are really the building blocks for brevity that you talked about last week. And I think you gave not only some great examples in home, but even some other examples about how students might use mood, the sentence structure, the pacing, the tension to represent their character, especially in third person. So I think it's a lot easier to give your character a bit more insight when you're writing in the first, but when you're writing in third, I think, Catherine Cole is so effective in representing her character within that style of narration. So that's really helpful. What about in terms of punctuation? Because Catherine Cole uses punctuation in a very deliberate way in her piece Home. So she uses it a lot to represent Ahmed's thoughts and experiences. And so if you can talk to us a little bit about that, and then maybe how teachers can support students in adapting this structural technique to control the rhythm in their own writing.
Yeah. So again, I think you mentioned this word brevity, and I think structure is very, very important in order to get our students to understand this term brevity. Remember, brevity is the conciseness of the piece. Like everything needs to be having a purpose, having a meaning. And when we look at this, this idea of structure, when we're looking at punctuation, we have to understand that punctuation isn't just the rules of English or the language in whichever we're writing. For us, when we're looking at Catherine Cole's Home, it's structure in Home. Punctuation plays that role of structure, and it's very important. So if we look at the line, for example, where she says, where it says, quote, "The rain has made the paths treacherous." You got a little hyphen, puddles, the ground slippery with the ruts of neglect. But he is happy now. So those dashes or those hyphens that we sort of see here break the flow. All right, like Ahmed's cautious steps. Then we see a full stop, which lands his sudden joy. Or if we see in this following line, I must pray. He thinks. Thanks for the living, meditations for the dead. So again, we see a comma pauses his resolve and a full stop sort of seals it. So every piece of punctuation is very, very important when it comes to the structuring of Cole's ideas, especially when it comes back to her purpose. So it links back to this idea of presenting Ahmed's migration story here as a refugee. So what we see here in those two examples is Cole uses this to slow us down or to jolt us. And it's something that students might consider. And this matches Ahmed's shifting headspace. All right, so we're getting into the mind of Ahmed here. So remember, Module C wants our students to play with structure like this. It's very, very important. So you might, for example, try and get them to look at the example when Ahmed is walking in that rain. All right. So rain falls. steps slow, hearts lift, a new day. Get them to play with punctuation. Maybe go through the different lines in the text and, get them to represent maybe a different mood. Get them to look at, well, what if this was the situation? How would you punctuate this sentence or this paragraph? Get them to really play with this, because if they can have some experience with playing with it, especially using an established text, they can definitely then apply it to their own work with a little bit more confidence and more purpose and meaning. I think that's significant. Look, for example, dashes are quite important. Dashes might be used to hesitate. A stop might be to settle, and that might be represented through that full stop. The semicolons could be in a similar function to your dashes, your ellipsis. Like, consider all of these different points. So in your writing, the students, in their writing in particular, they want to be using punctuation. Okay, I like this idea of commas for breath in particular, but don't overuse things as well. I think that's also important. They need to sort of have a very concise control of the way that they're using punctuation. And this goes back to that idea of making sure that every part of your imaginative piece has meaning and links back to their purpose. I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but I like texts that have sort of a moral sort of message to them. And, that is often tied in with their purpose of their text. Like, why are they writing this piece? And I think when they have that moral message, that purpose there, they can then start to look at things like sentence structure, punctuation, to control how the story feels them. They've got something to link their story to. And this is something that we really want to encourage our students with. But there's a few things there with punctuation. But look, use those established pieces. This is why we're looking at Mod C texts in particular, and get students to manipulate, play with it, and really, get into that sort of part of it. Get them to feel the text, because this is a text that is definitely full of that pathos that, Cole sort of evokes for Ahmed.
Yeah, I love that. That's excellent. That idea of the get them to feel the text and the pathos coming through, because there can be such a fine line between, overemphasizing, and then you slow down the pacing, and then you remove tension, or building up too fast and, enhancing the pacing too quickly, where the tension doesn't really feel realized. And I think Catherine Cole's piece here, it's so, like you said before, it's so accessible, it's so relevant, and it's such an easy way for students to not only see how the punctuation is being used, but then also consider what they can do. That's brilliant. Another thing, Adriel, that Catherine Cole does in Home is, within her narrative structure, she introduces some juxtaposition of various settings, and they're really used deliberately here to reveal Ahmed's displacement. So what can teachers and then students take away from this technique and the way that Catherine Cole uses it, and for them to consider how they can, use these juxtapositions to build tension in their own stories?
Yeah, no, that's good. And this might be like a way that we start the story. Like I said last week, the story starts off with, the building of setting, but we're already at this moment of tension. Who is this guy walking, through the streets of Western Sydney opposite this cemetery? And I think juxtaposition is definitely an important technique for students to understand. It's simple. It's something that they should know. And it's something that you can get your students to sort of look at in establishing their piece. Now, remember, juxtaposition is the placement of, two images side by side in order to highlight some sort of contrast. So here we sort of see the placing of opposites side by side. Okay. And it's structural gold. Again, we're going back to structure. I think structure is probably the huge thing for us in today's sort of episode. It's structural gold in Home. Okay, what we see is Cole writes, for example. I like this imagery because it sort of pertains quite a bit to me. Now, for me, I don't have a refugee background, but I do have a migrant sort of background. And it's something growing up in the west of Sydney that we sort of definitely had ingrained into us. But this line definitely in the text used to resonate with me quite a bit. It says, quote, "The wealthy one with its $1 million flats and shining department stores. The roads develop potholes. The trees thin out." Okay, I forgot to mention the ellipsis after the department stores. So it sort of highlights these two contrasting images of Sydney's sort of glossy harbour, which slams against Ahmed's rundown west, fibro houses of the west. And this structurally shows that he's an outsider in this new sort of country. again, you've got another contrast or juxtaposition in the text when it states the wicked blue of Sydney Harbour versus, quote, the scent of decay at Rockwood. And this juxtaposition sort of really emphasizes this beauty that he can't reach, or even, if we're looking further into it, the death that he can't escape. Because you think about it, why is he on this journey? What's his purpose for this? So it's definitely something that resonates with students. I mean, for us that have been teaching in the west of Sydney, it's something that we like to highlight quite a bit. But look, we're not discriminating for anyone anywhere in terms of the demographic locations in which we live. But it's something that's a reality of this multicultural fabric that is Australia, and that is in particular the diverse nature of Sydney's sort of landscape here.
That's right.
And
most migrant communities get set up in the West. It's a fact of our geographical landscape. Yeah,
100%. So again, I just have to emphasize this isn't just a description. The students fall into this sort of idea where it might just be describing two parts of the city, but it's used for intent and purpose here. As we're talking about, juxtaposition is used for that purpose of highlighting, like we just mentioned, maybe, it's a beauty that he can't reach, the death that he can't escape. It also builds this tension, which is baked into the narrative's bones. And this is why I said you could start your pieces with these sorts of juxtaposed settings. And, for us in Catherine Cole's sort of circumstance here, what she does by doing this is she reveals Ahmed's dislocation. This is another key value or an idea that we see in this text. So Module C loves this. For crafting perspective. I think it's something that I really focus on, crafting perspective. Again, if we look at Ahmed's perspective within the text, you can imagine Ahmed on a city walk where, the harbour gleams, the suburbs fade. And if we get students here to use a part of that Mod C text, you might get them to juxtapose settings, get them to really consider how it's juxtaposed, maybe get them to link it to their own work. So in their own work, they could say things like, a bright memory against a dark present, for example. And this pulls the readers into that push and pull nature of, that dislocation that he feels, or maybe this unattainable dream, or, the bittersweet reality of coming to a new country of milk and honey. But, the reality is very different compared to what they might have seen in the books and the national, I think he makes in reference to like a Reader's Digest or a National Geographic sort of book within the short story as well, which, we often see this and you hear from migrants' experiences. Oh my goodness, like Australia, it's the land of opportunity. And look, there's no doubt it is not. But what is the reality when people come here? People still need to work hard. People still need to work hard for a living. And we know this in 2025, the cost of living crisis, inflation, all of this sort of stuff. These are real sort of life issues that students can definitely incorporate into their own work. They resonate with the reader. And, even though Catherine Cole's piece is, now not as contemporary as it might have been, it's still so relevant to us because of its ability to sort of pull at the heartstrings with these human experiences.
Yeah. And like makes lovely links to, for example, module A, language, identity and culture as well. So it's a very universal text in that regard, text and human experience, obviously. Okay, awesome. Well, what about, can we talk a little bit about Cole's cyclical narrative form that this story and this plot follows? So in what ways does the cyclical narrative reinforce Ahmed's journey from one of loss to hope? And then how can students consider their use of this kind of structural approach to create some sort of resolution or perhaps unity in their own compositions?
A key thing in home, when we're looking at home, is we have to understand that form matters. Form is one of the key words in the Module C rubric, and form matters. I think that's something. And what we see here is in Cole's use of the cyclical sort of structure, this loops us back with a twist. Okay, it's got a purpose. It's not just a cycle for the sake of it being a cycle. It's got a twist. So what we see in her story is it starts with the government has given Ahmed a house to the west of the city. Okay, all isolation and uncertainty. But by the end, by the time he's back in his house and the rain is pelting down, the same house, that we sort of see right at the beginning, or is established right at the beginning, instead of having this, lack of hope, this isolation, this uncertainty, he's now got a purpose. And this purpose is waiting for his daughter. It's so beautiful, and it's got that message attached to that form there of that cyclical sort of nature. And you can also see this, even when as he walks through the cemetery. All right, the
Yeah.
cemetery walks through, like he walks this circle throughout the cemetery, and he experiences all types of loss in order to come to this realization of hope in the story. It's so pretty. It's so beautiful.
It's
The
lovely.
imagery is
Yeah.
gorgeous. And again, we have to just say this, and I have to mention this. Cole is not just using this randomly. It's not just, let's just throw this out and use a cyclical narrative for the sake of using it. Like we tell, a student, I'll put a simile in or metaphor. No, well, what is the purpose? What is your intention? What do you want your reader to think? What do you want them to take away? How are you building tension? How are you establishing mood? All of these questions are very, very important. And again, emphasizing the fact that it's not just random, it's a structural choice to show Ahmed's arc in this piece. Okay. And this gives the story unity. That's so important for us to consider. So Module C wants our students to think about form. It's so important. It's not just about plot, which is what students fall into, okay? A plot-based story. No. Plot is significant, don't get me wrong, but it's not the only thing. If you can combine your plot, thinking about form, your piece gets elevated to another level, especially if you're a student. Here's a little activity that you might try again. If we link back to our protagonist here, Ahmed. So let's think about Ahmed's day, where he's, in the text it says, the house waits, a hollow shell, hope returns, filling it. Okay, you can sort of see that whole narrative encapsulated in those 4 words there, 4 or 5 words there. But you start and end in one place. So you might get students to think about this for their own piece. It gets them to think about a moment in time as well. It gives their piece brevity once again. Okay. So in their own work, if they are deciding to choose this cyclical form, get them to loop back, say a character leaving and then reclaiming home. They want to tie it all together. And this is sort of that thing where even at the end of this piece, we have a sense of closure, but we don't have a full sense of closure because the piece still asks the reader about many different questions that can still be had. And this is that tension that remains within the piece. This is where we as the reader can take it and then understand it through our own context and our own lens and have different understandings of the text. And this is what makes it successful. It's a fantastic piece, especially when it comes to the new HSC. Now that Mod C does not have prescribed texts, it's something that you can still use. I 100% think, and I still think it remains relevant. So it's a wonderful piece for all students. You can sort of see that I'm talking about it with a little bit of passion today, because it remains so relevant to us. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. It's wonderful. And Cole's definitely a fantastic writer in emphasizing not only language choices, but today we focused on structure, style, and form. So it's a great piece to highlight those sorts of elements of a successful Mod C text.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I love the way that you very explicitly link to everyone how that cyclical form works together with Ahmed's kind of journey or arc and that kind of epiphany or realization at the end of from despair to hope, and how that offers then closure in the piece. You've done beautifully there. That's excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there any other? Thank you. You've done a brilliant job. Are there any other suggestions or reflections or final thoughts thinking about Cole's piece or Module C before we wrap up today's episode?
Cool. I do have one last thing. Let's just emphasize a few different things about Cole's work here. All right. Again, we're mentioning Cole's structure, style, and form. That's very, very important. Something that you want to sort of explicitly teach to the students. Unpack it yourself, have some annotations. There isn't too much online, so it's great for us because we can dive in and jump into it and make it our own. I think that's fantastic. Also look at things like the recurring motifs to the cyclical loop that we've just mentioned in the last sort of question. And this crafts a refugee's quiet fight for belonging. That might be the premise under which you sort of look at. So remember, Module C's goal. Module C's goal shines here. All right. Your writing grows by mastering your understanding of these different elements that we've just been speaking about. So in Mod C's, some of the key images that we see is Ahmed's roses, his broken rhythms, his juxtaposed worlds. they're tools that we can sort of get students to use in their own writing, all right, crafting their own
Yes.
pieces. So maybe they might
Yes.
craft a migrant's tale. Some of them might have this experience, right from experience. It's fantastic. With a motif like a faded photo, maybe some jagged syntax, maybe a tight cyclical form that we sort of just looked at. So get them to think about, what text inspires them. Once they've, looked at the text, it might not be Homer. There might be another text that might be similar to this, but like, okay, this resonates with me. Get them to share it with you as a teacher. And then as you sort of get some of those ideas, you might polish that craft together, that writing. And again, remember, it's the craft of writing. Get students to manipulate and play with these different elements that we've sort of just spoken about, amongst many other things. And that's when we start to look at a whole heap more of a piece that is filled with tension, a piece that is engaging and leaves your reader, your marker at the end of the day, with something that they can take away from your piece. It's like, oh, that was wonderful. That was fantastic. So yeah, write with structure and soul. I think that's probably a nice way we can sort of look at it. Get them to really write with their own
love that
message there. Yeah.
Structure and soul. That's amazing. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Adriel. You have really done justice to Catherine Cole's Home. I know how much you love this text and how often you teach it. And I have had the pleasure more recently of teaching this text, and it's beautiful. It hits you in your heart, your heartstrings,
The feels.
like it's just, and it's also not complicated, it's very accessible. So it works for all level of students. There's something that, any student in their crafting journey, that's something that they can pull and take from it.
Yeah.
So that's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Hey, you're welcome. You're welcome. Hopefully our listeners have something to take away from this. So that's wonderful.
I'm sure they will. Well, we might leave the episode here today. We might continue next week with some more Module C text, particularly, as you said, in the upcoming or the new prescriptions that are coming up. There is no more kind of prescribed text, but you still have to incorporate some. So hopefully we're giving you some suggestions of some of the Module C texts that are still around. We don't always have the luxury or always want to reinvent the wheel, but perhaps, going over them again in the next few weeks with us, as we've started to now, is hopefully going to give you guys some food for thought amidst the programming that you've no doubt started or are going to start shortly. So as always, if there's anything else we can talk about in our podcast and episode that you would be interested in, please comment, email us, contact us, and continue to like, subscribe, and engage with our content. The more we do that, I think the more listeners we can get in, and the more of a community and a bit of a community PL we can gather.
I agree. No, thank you so much, guys, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys next week.